FragStats?
I'm not going to take very long, and I don't claim to be an expert, but when I mentioned it on Monday, various people said, what's FragStats? So I thought I would just explain what FragStats is for anybody who might find it useful. So it's a, well, it says, okay, it's a program for spatial pattern analysis from categorical maps. That's all you need to know, probably, just about. But so it's developed by a group in Oregon State. The first version came out in 1995. They kept on developing it further. Various new metrics have been put in. It's currently a standalone package, but I discovered, thanks to Laura, that actually it's available in R, or at least some of it's available in R. It's not quite all of it. All of the metrics that are in FragStats are in landscape decision, landscape metrics.
So they've done some research to check which metrics are the most useful, and they've also included other ones as well. And they're peripherally involved in it if anyone wants to chat about that. But
yeah, okay. So, as I said, it's focused on summarising qualitative characteristics of parcels, so things like land cover classes or anything else you'd want to classify to a parcel, and it provides statistics at three different levels. It's at the patch level, or at a class level within a landscape, or at the whole landscape level. And of course you have to define what you mean by the landscape in each particular case. So for example, some work that I've done a while ago, we looked at national character areas as being the landscape that we wanted to summarise these various characteristics in. And I had a PhD student who worked on, well, they were 10 kilometre squares, a grid within Warwickshire for a project that she did as well. And some of the statistics are appropriate at all the levels, some are just appropriate at some. All I've done in the next few slides, or after these couple of pictures, is just really to describe the different sets of metrics that are there. I'm not going to try and do much more than that, but just sort of point you in the direction of where there is more information. There's a 187-page manual for FragStats, so you can find out all sorts of useful bits of pieces of information in there. This is just, this is probably not novel, but this is just demonstrating the variation in landscape structure that you might be wanting to capture. So these are two different national character areas that my PhD student a few years ago worked on, and that's a relatively unfragmented landscape, and that's a somewhat more fragmented landscape on the same kind of scale, just to show you the different kinds of patterns that you might be wanting to get at. So I say that the sets of metrics are described in a number of areas. So first set looking at area and edge, so looking at the size of patches, looking at the amount of edge that is created by those patches, summarising those in various ways, in terms of areas, in terms of perimeters, and the radius of gyration is essentially to do with, to some extent, with the shape, but it's more as to how far away bits of the patch are from the centroid of the patch. So it gives you a kind of a measure of that. And so again, point to make is some of these things, some of these measures are, can be measured at each of the different levels, but for some statistics, some of the metrics, the FragStats tool then provides distribution summary statistics per class or overall for the landscape that you're interested in. So there's lots of different ways of summarising this information about the structure. There are then some shape metrics, and the comment that is always made, or in the manual is made, that it's actually really difficult to define what we mean by shape. I don't know whether how useful all of these are, but things like the perimeter area ratio, a shape index that looks at the shape relative to the sort of the most compact shape that you can come up with, a fractal dimension index, and so on. The extension from the area metrics are the ideas of the core area metrics, which is looking at the area within a buffer within each of the patches. So it's sort of, again, sort of, I guess, thinking about various sort of ecological aspects in terms of dispersion parameters and so on, building that in. And I should say, so this requires some kind of user-defined buffer width. So some measure of the size of what you consider to be the buffer, which of course could be species dependent, and all sorts of things like that. Contrast metrics, which are essentially looking at, as it says, the change between different components. So it requires some kind of measure of similarity or dissimilarity between the classes within your landscape, and then looks in some way at the amount of contrast between different classes across the whole landscape. That's what that's trying to get at. There's a whole range of what they describe as aggregation metrics, which are all in some sense associated with how likely patches are to be aggregated, especially aggregated, sort of a measure of landscape texture in some way. Both sort of dispersion and interspersion, so that the spreading out of patches, but also the sort of the overlaps or the mixing of different class types. And then a series of diversity metrics that are essentially based on the fairly common metrics that I guess are used for plant or animal species as well. And just as a quick example of the application of where my PhD students use these metrics to explore some relationships. PhD, 5 years ago she completed it, looking at assessing the interaction between landscape characteristics and biodiversity, driven by a hypothesis from some previous work we did that I think was very common in the literature, but nobody seemed to ever go around to trying to prove that diversity or biodiversity, basically species richness, is in some way related to landscape diversity in pattern. And so that was what Charlotte was trying to explore. And as part of what she did was to combine the structural metrics from FragStats with various other information about land cover composition, and use a multiple logistic regression to predict butterfly presence or absence within the Warwickshire landscape that she was working in. And just as an example of how successful we thought that was, the right is where we actually observed butterfly species within Warwickshire, and this was the sort of spatial realization of the map that we generated from the model. And just the last thing is just the information about where those two packages are, so a link to the FragStat homepage and also the landscape metrics R package, if those are useful to people.
Right. Thank you very much.
That's it.